The subject I'll be introducing in general strokes now goes beyond what's commonly referred to by the term Islamic philosophy. Perhaps one should more properly call it philosophic thinking in the Islamic milieu. And there are three initial distinguishing features or markers for the subject as I'm introducing it that might help define its scope. These are first, the historical period. This extends from around the 7th century, soon after the Prophet's death in 632, to the 17th, as expressed in the works of major figure, the Persian philosopher Sadruddin Shirazi or Mullah Sadra, arguably the last of the great giants in this tradition. The second marker is the subject's primary language of expression, which is classical Arabic. These two markers already tell us or explain to us why, in fact, this tradition or this subject is sometimes referred to as Arabic philosophy or medieval Arabic philosophy. The third and final marker of this area of thought is its concern with general philosophical issues about the world. Now, many of these issues are already perhaps outdated, such as, for example, the Neoplatonist ideas about the association of an intellect and a soul to each one of the planets. But some of the other issues are still of concern, such as whether, in fact, matter is reducible to a few simple elements. All these three markers can be summed up by saying that Islamic philosophy, as I'm using the term and introducing it here, does not refer to a specific discipline or school of thought in the Islamic milieu, but covers any and all disciplines in the period in question that dealt in the classical Arabic language with matters that are, have been, or may become of general philosophical concern. Having defined the subject scope in this manner, the second remark that's important to make at the outset is that I intentionally avoided in making this definition a common distinction that's often made in the subject, in this field, between the so-called between the rational and the religious sciences, and the former, that's to say or the latter, the religious sciences, normally refers to fields such as law, linguistics, grammar, and the science of sometimes it's called dialectical theology or speculative discourse. This is, in Arabic, it's called kalam, literally speech. As to the rational sciences, this term normally refers in this field to philosophy as an umbrella term, covering all the sciences passed on to the Muslim world from earlier civilizations, primarily Greek. And because of its Greek roots, this part of intellectual history acquired the name falsafa, which is the Arabization of philosophia, and it typically regarded earlier Greek works from the pre-Socratics down to the Christian Neoplatonists as its frame of reference. Now, in contrast, the so-called traditional sciences regarded the Quran, both as a language and as a repository of truth, as its frame of reference. Now, having defined the subject in this way, the next question I wish to address is, what gave rise to philosophical thinking or thought in the Muslim world? How did it all begin? And my simple answer to this is that it all began in the context of the political and intellectual turmoils that arose in the aftermath of the death of the Prophet and concerning the question of who to appoint as his successor. Now, these turmoils began when a successor to the Prophet had to be agreed upon, and differences arose over who such a person might be. They developed into differences over how to choose him, or what conditions for holding this office are required. As differences persisted, Islam's first dynasty, the Umayyad, soon found itself challenged by movements based in Iraq's Basra that were both militant and ideological. How did this ideological opposition articulate itself? Came to be formulated around an initial set of questions to do with succession, and it held out the Quran itself as the natural frame for answering those questions. One can summarize these questions as one to do with justice, free will, and responsibility on the one hand, and with the role of human reason on the other. Simply put, these questions and the issues behind them were drawn in the following way. Has God endowed us with reason to distinguish between right and wrong? And are we free and therefore responsible for doing what is right and opposing what is wrong? Does not God being just mean precisely this? Is it not therefore wrong if, on seeing a wrong before us, even if it's one committed by a Muslim ruler or an official, we do not stand up to this wrong and to oppose it? As I already said, a frame of reference to answer these questions was needed, and the natural frame for a follower of the new religion to answer them was primarily the Quran itself. This meant that the need arose for an in-depth study of the Quran's language and the meanings therein. The fields of linguistics, hermeneutics, law, and discourse, kalam, thereby evolved. Soon the issues being debated widened to include such matters as knowledge, what this means, perception, what reasoning means, what the world is made of, how do we understand attributes or qualities, whether God has them, what are our obligations in life, are moral values objective and therefore discernible by reason, or are they simply rules imparted by God and therefore not yielding to any kind of rational evaluation? Beginning with oral discourse among scholars sitting around in circles in a mosque's precinct, discussing these issues, this tradition evolved over the centuries to become a veritable repository of philosophical inquiry into various fields that hold interest to this day. Okay, so side by side with these early inter-Muslim frictions, the Muslim world was quickly expanding geographically, coming to replace as it did this the two major neighboring civilizations of the time, the Byzantine and the Sassanid. The Byzantine world, already fractured ideologically between Monophysites and Nestorians, found the latter, the Nestorians, who did not believe in consubstantiation or in the divinity of the Virgin Mary, seeking refuge and opportunity in the expanded Muslim world. And it is their repository of intellectual wealth of Greek sources, under the name of philosophy, that first came to feed the technical and scientific needs of the growing Muslim caliphate. The first Muslim intellectual in the Muslim world to become known as a philosopher, a philosophe, was Al-Kindi, who lived in the 9th century. He was as much interested in the natural sciences, such as chemistry and technology, as he was in the metaphysical works of Aristotle or Plotinus. Other common names associated with this tradition people may be familiar with are Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. But obviously, the actual list is much longer, and it includes scholars who concentrated in their work on fields such as medicine or optics or mathematics or astronomy, and so on, in addition to their focus on metaphysical questions. If one were to take a step back now to try and answer the question, what are the distinguishing marks as far as philosophical thought in this widened definition is concerned? What is the distinguishing mark between these scholars who followed in the footsteps of Al-Kindi and the traditional scholars? One might tentatively suggest three major features. First, their focus on what they saw as a comprehensive and integral corpus of Greek sciences that reached them, crowned by one metaphysical theory or the other. Now, Aristotle's corpus for them was a paradigm in this regard, where the connection between the different areas in the received sciences was seen as being continuous, metaphysics providing the overall frame. In contrast, traditional scholars, in effect, rooted their inquiries in language, and specifically in the text of the Quran. They did not regard science per se as central to their inquiries. When they came to deal with the sciences, they did so not as religious scholars, but more like scientists. They did not do so as philosophers or religious scholars. Of course, one maybe can interpose here an exception, which is the work of some religious scholars who, from the point of view of their interest and concern in religious matters, studied astronomy, but primarily when they dealt with these matters, the way they dealt with them, I mean the religious, the science matters, they dealt with them as scientists. This way of distinguishing between the two traditions allows us to use the term metaphysicians and traditionists to refer to them, which I will henceforth use. So metaphysicians to refer to those people normally called philosophers, and traditionists to refer to those people who are normally described as philosophers. The second distinctive mark between those metaphysicians and traditionists is that while the metaphysicians relied heavily on a deductive methodology in their inquiries, traditionists relied in contrast on inference. I shall say a few words about these two distinguishing marks. The first one, how they approached the sciences, and the second one, how they approached the reasoning methodology in a minute. The third distinguishing mark is that while the metaphysicians were varied in their religious commitments or beliefs, what that meant for them, which religion they believed in, if any, traditionists were committed to Islam, whether that meant the meaning given it by the system in power or by its opposition. Let me now return to the first two marks or features I mentioned, namely what each party looked at for answers and what tools they used. Now, whereas the metaphysicians believed in the independent and a priori existence of abstract ideas or meanings as objects of study and as means to knowledge, the traditionists believed that any idea or meaning is in the first instance captured by language use, and more generally, by actual human behavior and conditions. This difference in approach was seminal. For example, the metaphysician would say that justice, or the good, or knowledge, or free will exist abstractedly in some metaphysical space and are accessed only through a series of intellectual conceptualizations from particulars. In contrast, the traditionists would deny the existence of such space and say that such meanings are mental and are arrived at through the investigation of language use and speech contexts. Indeed, they would argue that the mental existence of these meanings is a posteriori, that is, it is a manner of articulating sense perceptions. In this way, knowledge for them was a genre of belief, whereas for the metaphysicians, it was a genre of demonstrative, or later with other philosophers, those with a mystical bent, of experiential certainty. Now, this difference in approach between the metaphysicians and the traditionists was paradigmatically captured in a supposed debate between a logician and a grammarian. Whereas the logician argued the case for a universal language, namely logic, as a demonstrative epistemological tool, the grammarian argued a meanings in use case, or that meanings are very much part of the natural languages in which they are expressed. This debate, which occurs in one of the books written by a major literary figure, Al-Tawhidi, is simply reflects an argument, a debate that took place in the company, in the majlis of one of the officials of the caliphate at the time. It sort of reflects more widely the opposition between these two schools of thought, the traditional as opposed to those supporting the importation of the sciences from the Greeks. Now, this leads us directly to considering the second distinguishing feature between those groups that I pointed out, namely the tool used for reasoning. Metaphysicians relied heavily on deductive logic as a demonstrative tool that leads to certainty. The paradigm for them was for Aristotle the mathematical sciences, and the tool they typically used was the deductive syllogism. But by that time, this was developed, advanced to account for both propositional, so-called, and modal logics. The traditionists, on the other hand, were in the first place skeptical of the universal truths or abstract ideas of the metaphysicians, and they relied more in their reasoning on inference, or syllogism by analogy or example. There were different reasons for this, including their claim that universal statements are empirically unverifiable, given that infinite instances cannot be captured. And they are only posits if these statements were about metaphysical matters. A more relevant reason, really, for them to hold on to the inference was their ultimate dependence on specific Quranic statements or statements by the Prophet, which they held as examples to produce correct judgments on hitherto undecided cases. They were not averse to deductions as such, only particular about what count as universal statements that can be used as a basis for the production of knowledge. In this way, they held a universal statement occurring in the Quran to be true by virtue of being the word of God, but one about God or the universe or similar matters claimed by the metaphysicians to be mere posits or unverifiable, if not outrightly false. In other words, they denied the possibility of our having what one might call today synthetic a posteriori truths. This distinction allowed Muslim society to incorporate the hard sciences while rejecting the philosophers' metaphysical claims about the universe. This proved important, as traditional scholars began slowly to take over the pursuit of sciences such as logic, mathematics, astronomy well into the 18th century, and excel in them. One of the last famous figures associated with this being Ismail Qalanbawi, living and working in Istanbul as late as the 19th century. Let me now address the question of whether there were identifiable trajectories describing the evolution of both fields. My answer here is that there were indeed such trajectories, in both cases outlining a cumulative development of intellectual wealth for as long as classical Arabic remained what I shall call the language of power in the Muslim world. This circumstance began to change under the Ottoman Caliphate, when Ottoman came to replace Arabic, and the proportionate size of the Arab population in the Muslim world began to shrink and become an insignificant or marginal minority. However, within the period from the 8th to around the 18th or 17th century, classical Arabic remained a vibrant language of scholarship. And expressed in this medium, metaphysical philosophy during that period went through different phases, beginning with Al-Kindi, whom we mentioned earlier, with what one might regard as beginning steps in the 9th century, guided by Greek translations of Aristotle and the Neoplatonists on the nature of the world and what we know about it. Then going through a maturer phase with Al-Farabi and others in the 10th century, mostly Baghdad, where the dependence on the Greek heritage begins to reflect an independence of mind. This is followed by a third phase in the 11th century, arguably a peak and a turning point in terms of creativity and the merging of the two hitherto separate traditions. This phase and style is associated with Avicenna. Thereafter, metaphysical philosophy continues in two directions, one Aristotelian, associated with Averroes, and the other more imaginative, whether with a mystical turn, as that expressed by Suhrawardi, or with a holistic perspective as that expressed by Mulla Sadra. Suhrawardi went into a whole world of the world being made up of light, while Mulla Sadra, while using light, in fact, transforms our perspective and proposes being a kind of Parmenidean notion as being the basis of what constitutes the grid of existence. Throughout, the issues of primary concern remained the same, namely the nature of the universe, light, being, and man's role or place in it. As to the so-called traditional sciences, these also registered cumulative maturation after the early days in the Basra, especially in the fields of linguistics, as we said, law, and discourse or speculative discourse. In law, Sharia, and the fundamentals of law, one could identify four phases beginning in the 7th century and extending well into the 14th. Into the 14th in the figure of the Andalusian Al-Shatibi. Throughout, an advanced philosophy of law was developed, focusing on law's prudential function. The importance of this area in philosophic thinking can in no way be underestimated. A purpose for God's law, beyond the fact it was accepted as law, had to be identified and then reduced so as to relate to specific domains in human life. The good of the individual was identified as that purpose, and this was then mapped onto a logarithm of the various components of that constitute that good, such as religiosity or moral life, the intellect, and material welfare or well-being. As to the field of discourse, kalam, early debates on justice and free will developed into mature arguments in political thought, moral philosophy, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and epistemology. As the subjects of pure science became independent from formal philosophy, traditional scholars slowly engaged in and thereafter excelled in these sciences, especially in astronomy and mathematics. Indeed, some of the major advances in this field, right up to the 18th century, are associated with these scholars rather than with the philosophers properly so-called. So, although the philosophers properly so-called were mostly aware of these sciences, astronomy and so on, and conversant with them, it was really scientists whose background was religion that in fact excelled in the 12th and the 13th and the 14th centuries in the various major astronomical research institutions that were set up in Persia and further east. If now one were to ask what specific contributions to the history of ideas these different disciplines contributed, one could produce a long list, not just those that seeped into Renaissance thought in Europe through the active work of Latin translators, but even beyond that to ideas that presage some that became current in the thought of the Enlightenment, including the thought of philosophers like Hume and Kant. To refer to just one example, the principle, for example, of the identity of discernibles, commonly associated with Leibniz, can be found almost everywhere one looks in the literature of that period. Procedures in first-order logic, formal procedures, such as universal instantiation, what goes by that name nowadays, as well as in modal logic, can also be found in logical works from that period. The concern of the traditionists in language led them to explain meanings, such as that of free will, in terms of speech acts. In other words, philosophical literature from that period, if little known in the West, is replete with ideas that are familiar in Western thought. Let me finally call again to mind that in this brief talk, I intentionally refrained from presenting this tradition of philosophical thought in what has become a common manner by focusing only on scholars who went under the name of philosophers of a particular school. Major philosophical and scientific issues, I claimed, were handled both by philosophers and religious scholars, and philosophy itself was inclusive of the logical and the imaginative. To conclude, I must point out that my claim is not that philosophical thinking ceased in the Muslim world by the 18th century. My argument rather has been that with its primary medium, i.e. classical Arabic, ceasing to be the language of power with the Ottoman takeover, this particular tradition of philosophic thinking in that language came to an end.